Welcome to a deep dive into the mysterious and often misunderstood condition known as chronic fatigue syndrome. Today, we're going to unravel the complexities of this illness and explore its causes, symptoms, diagnosis, treatment, and the profound impact it has on the lives of those who suffer from it. Imagine waking up day after day, feeling utterly exhausted, as if a truck has run over you. You're not just tired, you're so fatigued that getting out of bed, brushing your teeth, or taking a shower feels like climbing a mountain. That's the reality for millions of people who live with chronic fatigue syndrome, a condition that is still met with skepticism and often dismissed as being all in your head. But I'm here to tell you that chronic fatigue syndrome is real, it's debilitating, and it deserves serious attention. In this video, we'll look at the science behind chronic fatigue syndrome, share some inspiring personal stories, and discuss what can be done to manage the symptoms and improve the quality of life for those affected. By the end of this journey, you'll have a better understanding of what chronic fatigue syndrome really is, how it impacts people physically, mentally, and emotionally, and what the future holds for research and treatment. The basics. What is chronic fatigue syndrome? Chronic fatigue syndrome, also known as myalgic encephalomyelitis, is a complex, long-term illness that affects various systems of the body, including the immune system, nervous system, and even cellular energy production. While the primary symptom of chronic fatigue syndrome is extreme fatigue that doesn't improve with rest, there are a range of other symptoms that can vary in intensity. Chronic fatigue syndrome is not just being tired, it's an overwhelming, incapacitating fatigue that makes it difficult to carry out even the most basic functions. Imagine waking up and feeling like your body weighs 10 times more than it should. Your mind is in a fog, and simple tasks like holding a conversation or focusing on a book seem impossible. Symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome. The symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome can be wide-ranging, and they often differ from person to person. However, there are some hallmark signs that most sufferers experience. Extreme fatigue. This is not just feeling tired after a long day, but a profound, debilitating exhaustion that doesn't go away with rest. Post-exertional malaise, a worsening of symptoms after any physical or mental activity that can last for days or weeks. Even mild exertion, such as walking to the kitchen or reading, can trigger post-exertional malaise. Cognitive difficulties, often referred to as brain fog. This includes problems with memory, concentration, and information processing. Muscle and joint pain, chronic widespread pain without inflammation or visible injury. Unrefreshing sleep. Even after a full night's sleep, people with wake-up feeling as if they haven't slept at all. Headaches and migraines. Frequent, sometimes severe headaches are common. Dizziness and orthostatic intolerance. Difficulty standing upright or feeling lightheaded when standing. Flu-like symptoms. Many sufferers experience sore throats, swollen lymph nodes, and sensitivity to light and sound. These symptoms often wax and wane, meaning a person might have days where they feel somewhat better, only to be hit by a crash later. It's this unpredictability that makes living with chronic fatigue syndrome so difficult. The emotional and mental impact of chronic fatigue syndrome. The physical toll of chronic fatigue syndrome is immense, but it's important to also acknowledge the mental and emotional burden this condition brings. Many patients with chronic fatigue syndrome report feelings of isolation and frustration because the disease is invisible. People with chronic fatigue syndrome often hear things like, "You look fine." "Are you sure you're not just depressed?" "If you just got more exercise, you'd feel better." These misconceptions can lead to a lack of understanding and support from friends, family, and even healthcare providers. It's not uncommon for chronic fatigue syndrome patients to experience depression and anxiety as a result of their illness, not to mention the social withdrawal that comes from being too exhausted to engage in normal activities. The science, what causes chronic fatigue syndrome? Here's where things get tricky. Despite decades of research, the exact cause of chronic fatigue syndrome remains elusive. What we do know is that chronic fatigue syndrome is a multi-system disorder, meaning it affects several different systems in the body. The most prominent theories suggest that the cause may be a combination of factors. Viral infections. Some people develop chronic fatigue syndrome after a viral infection, such as Epstein-Barr virus, the virus that causes mono, but no definitive viral link has been found. Immune system dysregulation, chronic fatigue syndrome. Sufferers often have abnormalities in their immune system. This could mean their immune system is constantly activated, leading to inflammation and fatigue. Hormonal imbalances. Researchers have found differences in the levels of certain hormones, like cortisol, in people with chronic fatigue syndrome. However, it's unclear whether these imbalances cause the illness or are a result of it. Mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondria are the powerhouses of our cells, and some research suggests that in chronic fatigue syndrome patients, the mitochondria don't function properly, leading to energy deficits. Genetics. There may be a genetic component to chronic fatigue syndrome. Some families seem to have a higher prevalence of the condition, suggesting that certain genes may predispose individuals to develop chronic fatigue syndrome. Stress and trauma. Many chronic fatigue syndrome patients report that their symptoms began after a period of intense stress or physical trauma, such as surgery or a car accident. While the exact cause remains a mystery, what's clear is that chronic fatigue syndrome involves a complex interaction of factors, and more research is needed to fully understand this debilitating condition. Diagnosing chronic fatigue syndrome, a long and frustrating journey. One of the most frustrating aspects of chronic fatigue syndrome is how difficult it can be to get a diagnosis. There is no single test for chronic fatigue syndrome, and because its symptoms overlap with so many other conditions, like depression, fibromyalgia, and multiple sclerosis, patients often go through years of medical tests and consultations before receiving a definitive diagnosis. The diagnostic process for chronic fatigue syndrome typically involves exclusion of other conditions. Doctors will first rule out other causes of fatigue and pain, such as thyroid disorders, anemia, and sleep apnea. Symptom criteria. To be diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, a patient must have experienced unexplained, persistent fatigue for at least 6 months, along with 4 or more additional symptoms like cognitive impairment, unrefreshing sleep, and post-exertional malaise. Functional assessment. Many doctors use tools like the Fatigue Severity Scale or the Chalder Fatigue Questionnaire to measure the severity of a patient's fatigue and how it impacts their daily life. Getting a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome can be an emotionally draining process. Many patients are dismissed by doctors who don't fully understand the condition, leading to years of misdiagnosis or undertreatment. Living with chronic fatigue syndrome. Coping strategies. While there is currently no cure for chronic fatigue syndrome, there are ways to manage the symptoms and improve the quality of life for those affected. Pacing. One of the most effective strategies for managing chronic fatigue syndrome is called pacing, which involves balancing activity with rest to avoid triggering post-exertional malaise. This means learning to recognize your limits and not pushing through the fatigue. Sleep hygiene. Improving sleep quality can help mitigate some of the fatigue. This might involve establishing a regular sleep routine, creating a comfortable sleep environment, and avoiding caffeine or electronics before bed. Diet and nutrition. Some chronic fatigue syndrome patients find that certain diets, such as a high-protein, low-carb diet, help to stabilize their energy levels. Others find relief through anti-inflammatory foods, supplements, or elimination diets to identify food sensitivities. Medications and supplements. While there's no specific drug for chronic fatigue syndrome, some patients benefit from medications that address individual symptoms, such as pain relievers, antidepressants, or sleep aids. Supplements like magnesium, CoQ10, and vitamin B12 are sometimes recommended to support energy production. Therapies. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and graded exercise therapy, GIET, have been controversial in the treatment of chronic fatigue syndrome, but some patients find them helpful when used carefully and under the supervision of a knowledgeable healthcare provider. However, many patients caution against overexertion, as GIET can lead to worsened symptoms if not properly tailored to the patient's capacity. The future of chronic fatigue syndrome research. The scientific community is starting to pay more attention to chronic fatigue syndrome, thanks in part to patient advocacy and the recognition that this condition has been under-researched for far too long. New studies are focusing on biomarkers. Researchers are searching for biomarkers, measurable substances in the body, that could lead to a more straightforward diagnostic test for chronic fatigue syndrome. Immunological treatments. Some studies are exploring immune-modulating therapies, such as rituximab, an antibody treatment used for cancer and autoimmune diseases, to see if they can help reset the immune system in chronic fatigue syndrome patients. Mitochondrial function. Investigations into how mitochondria function in chronic fatigue syndrome patients could lead to new treatments that target cellular energy production. Living with chronic fatigue syndrome is a daily battle, but many people with the condition have found ways to thrive despite their limitations. Some have turned to advocacy, using their voices to raise awareness and push for better research funding. Others have found creative outlets like writing, art, or music that help them cope with their illness. Chronic fatigue syndrome is a complex and life-altering illness that affects millions of people worldwide. It's an illness that's often invisible, misunderstood, and overlooked by both the medical community and society at large. But for those living with chronic fatigue syndrome, the struggle is all too real. By understanding the science behind the condition, listening to the voices of patients, and pushing for more research and better treatments, we can move towards a future where chronic fatigue syndrome is no longer dismissed or ignored. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you or someone you know is struggling with chronic fatigue syndrome, know that you're not alone, and there is hope for a better tomorrow. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on more health-related topics. Stay strong, stay informed, and most importantly, take care of yourself. Also, click on the video to your right, and the one below is what YouTube thinks you should watch.